You're listening to The Means of Production, the origin story of WRIR and community-powered radio in Richmond. I'm Whitney Whiting.
We were in this radio wasteland.
I drove home and I said to my mom, "Mom, I'm going to change the world through radio."
Every once in a while, somehow the forces of whatever will just hand you this perfect moment on a platter where you get to be that lever that moves the world for a moment.
It's Sunday, October 6th, 2024, and Melissa Vaughn is very excited.
Good morning. Good morning. So we're at 1806 East Main Street.
In just a few days, construction crews will begin turning this Shockoe Bottom storefront into
WRIR's permanent home. So right now it's a storefront.
After decades at its original location, right above popular Richmond music venue, The Camel, WRIR is on the move.
You want to go in?
Yeah.
Okay, let's go in. I'm very excited. So this door will not exist. And like I said, it will be to the left.
For now, it's mostly just an empty shell of a building. But as the station's current president, Melissa has a vision.
The front door will be moved over. This will open up a lobby space, and then we will have what is called a fishbowl studio. So you can see our DJs, and they can see you, and they can interact. Right here is where our brand new elevator is going to be. An elevator, so that anybody who's a volunteer can do all activities on the first and second floors. And one of the things I also am pretty stoked about, obviously, this is pretty cool. Elevator, big studio, fishbowl, but this wall right here, this will be our history of WRIR wall.
So right when you walk in?
Right when you walk in, you will see that. You will also see digital, photo stories of our volunteers, the events that we're doing, the events we've done in the past.
It's been 20 years since WRIR officially launched in January of 2005. And with these new milestones on the horizon, it's time to look back at that history.
The current control of radio is too concentrated for a healthy democratic society.
To revisit how and why WRIR was born.
That's why Radio Free Oregon Hill supports the Radio Free Richmond project.
So in this, its 20th anniversary year, we're going to hear from the media activists and radio rebels and just everyday Richmond people who made it happen. And it's an amazing story, one that I'm ashamed to admit I really didn't know. It was my friend Fareed Allen Shincius, Richmond's longtime history maker and activist, who told me what a watershed moment WRIR was.
And there were people, just like with WRIR, there are people who have no idea what Richmond was like absent WRIR.
It's hard to imagine a Richmond without Allen Shincius. But for listeners who are unaware, Allen passed on December 5th, 2024. Without Allen, this oral history project wouldn't have happened at all. In fact, without Allen, WRIR might not have happened at all. Allen's legacy to Richmond is vast and monumental, and he is already deeply missed. But this story is part of what he's leaving behind. And of course, it wasn't just Allen who made WRIR possible. You'll be hearing a lot of different voices in this series, all people who were totally critical to WRIR's success.
It's an institution. There are people on the air that weren't born yet when WRIR started.
We're a bunch of normal people from Richmond, Virginia who came together and changed the fabric of the United States. We're part of this huge quilt of radio stations.
Because this story goes beyond just Richmond, Virginia. The people here played a unique role in the collective making of something called low power FM.
Overnight, it went from like 50 low power FM stations around the country to 500.
And if you know Richmond, that should not come as a surprise. So what made these people think they could just start a radio station? In fact, why? why did they need to start one at all? I keep coming back to this description Alan gave me of what Richmond was like before WRIR.
Yeah, well, it's concretized Confederate dungeon energy. They had things locked down and locked into their mode of thinking, and only their things were permitted. Only those who came out of that legacy were allowed to hold the power.
Fellow RIR alum Jack R. Johnson.
It did not want, it was a place where it did not want to be disturbed. You got the sense, and this is me coming here in the early 80s, right? It was always, you keep the golf course clean, you make sure Monument Avenue doesn't have any detritus on it, you keep your monuments polished, and we'll also have to give some funds to the Daughters of the Confederacy because that's important.
In other words, Richmond was long overdue for a cultural shift, and radio was a perfect place to start. Here's former WRIR DJ Dustin Richardson.
One of the things you need in a restaurant kitchen is good music, especially in the small kitchens in Richmond. If the people in the kitchen aren't all on the same rhythm, it's just chaos. And at the time, radio in Richmond was terrible, was absolutely terrible. Imagine the worst radio station on the air right now, and that was the best of it.
There wasn't anything. There was the U of R station.
Past president and show host Liz Humes.
But then the U of R station was hard to figure out, would drop off air. But then it was the repeat. I don't even think I listened to commercial radio at all.
And longtime Richmond organizer and host of the Defenders Live, Anna Edwards.
Radio in Richmond at that point, we were always talking about how it was all tinned and programmed, right? So like the playlists had been established in somebody's office and they're based on the top 10 and they play and they repeat. And so DJs don't seem to have very much to do.
But this wasn't just a Richmond problem. As James Hickman says, bad radio was everywhere.
At one point I was in Hawaii and the radio station, the music was exactly the same thing that I listened to in Northern Virginia. So the whole thing had just become homogenous sound. And the argument with low power FM was, look, we're losing this whole thing of having the local, hyper-local information on the radio.
So if it wasn't always like this, if radio used to be more varied and local, what happened?
What was the tripwire or the tipping point? Was it a rule change? Was it a legislative change?
Well, you're jogging my memory, so I can answer that.
The tripwire I'm wondering about was all of a sudden we went from 1,800 stations to bazoo, a handful. What changed? Was it legislation? Or?
Yes, it was. It was the 1996 contract on with America.
That's Christopher Maxwell, sometimes known as Chris or just Max. Either way, he's an important person to this story.
I say on America because it pretty much killed us. Yeah, Newt Gingrich and his slimy little bunch.
I interviewed him with Alan, who was among the first to join Max in his crusade for community radio.
Convince Bill Clinton, Mr. Triangulation, he wants to try to steal away Republican votes. Hey, side note, that doesn't work. So what he did this thing called triangulation where he would try to out-conservative them. And the way that manifested as a law was the 1996 Contract with America.
Contract with America was a sweeping conservative agenda. And along with it came a piece of legislation that would change everything for radio broadcasting. Here's Dustin again.
It all stems back to the Telecommunications Act of 1996. They cleared away the restrictions on how many radio stations a single company can own in a market. And so with that restriction gone, Clear Channel and Westwood bought up all of the radio stations in Richmond, except for maybe one or two.
They bought up so many stations and cut so many jobs that Clear Channel soon became known as Clear Cut, as in to clear cut a forest.
Because they would come in and wipe out jobs left and right. It was just an absolute slaughter of the broadcast industry. I realized I was so glad I did not get a mass comm degree because in one fell swoop, they wiped out 2/3 of all jobs in media. Just gone.
Up until then, you need to be in the listening area to own the radio station. You needed to be within the listening area of the radio station to be an owner of a radio station. And, you know, their argument was the internet's here, things are really changing, this should be broader. And they broadened that in the Contract with America contract. And next thing you know, you've got Clear Channel.
Yeah, well, they're just one of many, but they're a great example.
Do remote broadcasting to 10, 12, 15, 20, 24 stations from one studio and one DJ and drop all local news and information. I mean, they might have a community bulletin board, but no news coverage. They were just no local DJs, no local...
Yeah, not even a phone number for the police to call for emergencies.
So just centralized. It just became
automated, centralized, and remote controlled.
And how exactly was this automation possible? Was this through some new technological change? Yes, says Max, but also Ronald Reagan.
There are two things that Reagan did, not just one. One is that people know about, which was when his new appointees to the Federal Communications Commission got rid of the fairness doctrine. Lots of people know about that one. Lots of people write about that, and it was awful. But that wasn't actually the most important one. The most important one is another one of those secrets that nobody talks about, that's not even a secret if you know where to look, which is they changed the way you're allowed to receive a signal. So before Ronald Reagan's FCC...
Before Reagan's FCC, says Max, if stations wanted to repeat programming from another station, they had to pick up the signal directly over the literal airwaves. And a lot of things can get in the way of that signal. Mountain ranges, the weather, and the literal curvature of the Earth.
So you had to receive the signal directly. Then you had to have a person at station B to receive the signal into a recording device, usually a reel-to-reel tape deck, set for 10 hours. So you get these big reels that take 10 hours at a time, and they record like the whole broadcast. And then they literally cut it up with razor blades, insert their local stuff, so it's all very time-consuming. You have the literal person there with a phone number that you can call and say, hey, this train just derailed downtown and it's on fire. I need you to like tell everybody, don't breathe the smoke, get the hell out, go upwind, right? There was somebody there to answer the phone. So Reagan comes along, he says, well, you know, we don't need to do it this antiquated way. We're gonna let you receive several things. First, you can receive your new signal from station A over the satellite. Now, the mountain range makes no difference anymore because station A over here on the other side of the mountain range sends their signal up to a satellite, bounces down to station B. Mountain ranges, clouds, curvature of the Earth, no longer a problem. Suddenly, one religious station can repeat to 20, 30, 200 stations like that.
Another new change from Reagan's FCC, stations could now operate remotely, typically one central operator for every 5 to 6 stations. And while it was mostly rural stations that first adopted these changes, over time, they would become more common across the radio landscape. So by the late 90s, all of these changes, from media ownership rules to the ins and outs of program rebroadcasting, resulted in homogeneous sound on radio dials across the country. And in Richmond, it was agreed. The sad state of radio had to change. This idea was most clearly illustrated in the December 1998 special radio issue of Throttle magazine, a robust publication dedicated to Richmond's music subculture. The issue featured articles with titles like Radio Rut and Why I Hate Radio. One column even described radio as a deadbeat dad, with the programming powers that be consistently letting you down. But Throttle didn't stop its colorful critique at just commercial radio. Another headline posed this question: what in the world is going on over at WCVE-FM? Writer David Brown noted that Richmond's local NPR affiliate, WCVE, had recently altered their usual lineup. He noted that, quote, an alarming number of programs with ethnic and cultural diversity have been retooled, put on hold, or canceled altogether, leaving mostly wall-to-wall classical music. And at a time when many NPR affiliates were beginning to air exciting new shows like Fresh Air and This American Life, listeners in Richmond were taking note. Here's James Hickman again.
You know, I moved here and I was shocked to find, because I came here from Roanoke area, they didn't have Fresh Air.
Right.
They didn't have, the local NPR station, it was a Texaco opera on Sunday.
Right, right.
I mean, I was like, who is their market? It was not me.
CBE at the time was still classical music 90% of the day. They had a couple of shows, but they were mostly classical music.
Like James, Liz Humes first encountered alternative news and talk programs at other public radio stations in Virginia. She now lives in Norfolk again, home of public radio station WHRV, whose programming, she says, changed her life.
I heard the news and talk on the WHRO station here at 21 years old, which would have been, early 90s. And it was kind of the formation of NPR and News and Talk. And when that sound and that kind of an idea really came together, and it may have been earlier than the early 90s. And for me, it was life-changing because you could continue to learn with busy hands, learn differently. And it wasn't people screaming at you. It was illumination and edification while you were doing something else. Now that idea is just so omnipresent. It's, everybody listens to podcasts.
But once Liz moved to Richmond, she could no longer hear those programs anymore because WCVE, Richmond's public radio station, wasn't playing them. So she got creative.
I had rigged up in my Oregon Hill apartment this thing so that I could listen to from my radio. I had kind of like a speaker cord hanging out the window so that I could catch good news and talk from WHRV, which was here, through the air. On good days, sound will carry. On clear days, sound will carry. So on good days, I could catch it.
But Liz and James and Throttle Magazine were not the only ones questioning Richmond's public radio lineup.
One of the whole reasons we started up in the first place all stems back to Chris Maxwell wanting WCBE to air Talk of the Nation, and they refused to do so for whatever reason. But Talk of the Nation's a great show. It was a fantastic show, and so that was the very first one that we put on our schedule board. The very first one we wanted to carry, and the very reason that there's a satellite dish in the backyard of WRIR Studios, because that was what we wanted to get from the satellite. We wanted that live Talk of the Nation radio.
Here's longtime host of Global A-Go-Go, Bill Lupoletti.
Well, this was the beginning of Talk of the Nation. It was a call-in show that they started at NPR headquarters because people, the Gulf War, it was a really traumatic event for the country. And it was the first time in history where you could actually follow a war in real time on TV. I remember I was working as a securities trader, and we hauled these TV sets out onto the trading floor. We had never had those before, so that you could watch CNN to see what was going on in the war. Because that was really important for bonds. It was really important for foreign currencies. And so it was wall-to-wall coverage. And at NPR, they started this talk show so that people could call in from all over the country and ask their questions and have these dialogues. And that is the program that became Talk of the Nation. And they ran it for about a year at WCVE FM. And then they went back to the classical music again. And that's when Max was out there with the petition saying, you got to bring this back. And that famous story that he tells where he finally got a meeting with the management. This is the same management that I told you didn't care about local programming, the very same people.
You all have heard that story.
I don't know that I have.
No, she hasn't.
Oh, well, I can repeat it. It's not that long. Okay. But that is like the quote-unquote official origin story.
Okay.
All right, so I guess I may as well tell that one.
The origin story.
Official story.
Dum, da, dum, dum.
All right, so I'm a taxi cab driver, during the first Gulf War. So WCVE 88.9 had this show called Talk of the Nation on the air, and absolutely saved my brain, because I'm in this taxi cab with nothing to listen to except WRVA, which has got absolute all the worst Neanderthal troglodytes that you could dig out of from underneath the worst, muddiest rock you can find. So they're playing Talk of the Nation, and it's great. I mean, they have awesome guests. The talk show host is really good at letting people speak entire thoughts. That's also the reason that I really enjoyed Pat Buchanan, even though he's right-wing. He was a great talk show host because he let people say their entire thought out. He'd leave a little pregnant pause to make sure they're done, and then he would take them apart. Anyway, so at the end of the Gulf War, quote-unquote end, they stopped airing it. So I called up WCV and I said, that was a great show. Why don't you guys keep playing it? And they're like, well, you know, it's off the air. I'm like, yeah, it's off the air at your station, but I'm pretty sure it's a syndicated show. I drive up to DC a week later. Sure enough, I hear it on the station up there. I drive back down. I'm like, good news. They're still on the air up in DC. You guys can put them on. They're like, well, we don't have airtime for it. I'm like, what? Because you don't have a second frequency? And they're like, that's right. I'm like, well, WHRO, WHRV, they in Norfolk, they just built another transmitter. And they're like, well, there's not frequencies. I'm like, I find that hard to believe. There's only 36 stations that I can receive in Richmond. I go down to my hometown of Florida, and I can pick up 63 stations. It's a little hard for me to believe there isn't room. And they're like, I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember their exact response, but it was pretty much, well, what kind of engineer are you?
But Max wasn't going to stop there. He knew someone in the industry who could tell him whether there were any available frequencies in the Richmond metro area.
I said, hey, you've got that fancy $20,000 software. Can you run Richmond through it and find me a frequency? About 5 seconds later, he goes, yeah, 300 watts at 89.3 on Church Hill. Okay. I go back to WCV. I'm like, good news. I did the engineering. 300 watts, 89.3 on Church Hill. Nice and urban, right in the middle of the population, dirt cheap, 300 watts. We can find that in closets. And they looked like, where the hell did this kid come from?
Max felt that he was getting stonewalled. So he did what any sensible activist would do next. He decided to attend their board meeting.
They're not used to plebes coming into their holy boardroom.
But they are public meetings.
Yeah, quote unquote public, as we'll find out in a moment. So I go in there and they don't expect me, so they don't have any filters set up. And so I'm witnessing. And then they came to the time of the board meeting where they're like, I throw it open to questions. So I repeated all the same thing.
He repeated all the same things. 89.3, 300 watts, Church Hill. He even had a wad of dollar bills handy. 365 of them.
They had this program where if you donated $1 a day, you could make an announcement on WCVE. So I had 365 $1 bills in my shirt pocket as a visual flourish because I could fan out the $1 bills and say, hey, I'll give you this if you'll let me announce, welcome Talk of the Nation back to Central Virginia. And at that point, they all looked shocked. And the general manager said, slam the gas, not the general manager, excuse me, the chairman of the board, A. Prescott Rowe, which is super important, as I'll mention in a moment. A. Prescott Rowe slams his gavel, and he says, well, we're going to enter a closed session. All the public, get out. Okay. So I'm outside.
Was it just you, the public?
There were like two others. So we go out, they leave. I hang out in the front foyer thinking, So I'm waiting out there, and the general manager comes out. Miller, is that his name? Anyway, he came up and he said, yeah, we wanted to talk to you because you're still here. Like, can we go into this conference room? You know, how can we help you? And we repeated the same thing all over. And I said, 89.3, 300 watts.
At that point, says Max, WCVE's program manager offered him some advice.
And that's when he leaned forward and started yelling so strongly. And he was so angry, he was turning bright red. And he's yelling so loud, he's getting spit on the lenses of my glasses. And he says, well, if you know so damn much about radio, why don't you start your own station? And I had the 365 $1 bills fanned out. I flipped them shut, I shoved them in my shirt pocket. I said, that's a great idea. And I got up and started walking out of the room. And at that point, Mr. Miller was like, is there something we can do? I'm like, I think we covered all that. And I walked on out.
You know, and they finally said, well, if you feel so strongly, you should start your own radio station. That's a great story.
It is a great story.
And they should never have said that to him.
course, that's only the beginning. In fact, it's barely the beginning, but it is the official origin story. And yes, it is great. But there was one last piece of information, something that convinced Max there was only one way forward. And according to Max, it all goes back to A. Prescott Rowe, that guy who pounded his gavel and essentially shut down what had been up until that point a public board meeting. Max couldn't understand why the board was so resistant to putting up another transmitter. He figured it could only benefit the station, and he knew they had the money to do it.
They didn't have as big a footprint as they do now. And I'm like, a second transmitter would be way cheaper than upping the power on that thing. And you'd have a whole nother urban audience. I'm like, I don't see any negative here. I don't know why you guys are so resistive. Like, it's all pluses. What's the problem? And I finally figured it out. A. Prescott Rowe was the PR manager for Ethel Corporation.
Ethel Corporation is headquartered in Richmond, Virginia. They're in the gasoline and oil business, among other things, and they were a pretty big deal.
They literally had the man in charge of public relations for the biggest oil company in the world running an NPR station in the state capital. That's why they are absolutely never going to have a talk show that would ever talk about anything substantial. Yeah, I get kind of revved up about this because when I first realized this, I got numb. I lost control of my legs. I sat down on the back porch of my house. I had no idea the stakes were this high. I had no idea the interconnections behind the scenes. And then once it suddenly, like, the realization blossomed before me, I'm like, there is no way out of this trap except to build your own channel.
Sounds easy, right? Just build your own channel. Well, it would take a long time for WRIR to make it to the airwaves. There is a lot more to this origin story. A note about WCVE. They rebranded in 2019 and are now more commonly known as Virginia Public Media, or VPM, and they've done some really great local reporting in recent years. I especially loved Roberto Rodan's City Hall coverage and Yasmin Juma's reporting on Richmond public housing. As for A. Prescott Rowe, I reached out to VPM to make sure we had all our facts straight. They confirmed for me that, yes, A. Prescott Rowe served on WCVE's board from 1964 to 2004. Additionally, I was able to find a Prescott Rowe on Facebook who lists Vice President of External Affairs for Ethel Corporation in his online bio and is now retired. As far as I can tell, they're the same person. VPM declined to comment on the rest of Max's story, given that the people involved have either retired or moved on from VPM and are no longer with the station. A huge thank you to the community radio all-stars heard in this episode: Melissa Vaughn, Christopher Maxwell, Anna Edwards, Jack R. Johnson, Liz Humes, Bill Lupoletti, James Hickman, Dustin Richardson, and of course, our dear friend, Alan Shinsius. A special thanks to Liz for listening to this episode and offering advice on the edit and script. And special thanks to SB for letting me raid the Radio Free Oregon Hill Audio Archive. This episode featured music from the Free Music Archive, including tracks by Taylor Hope Bynum, Tomas Fujiwara Duo, Lobo Loco, What Cheer Brigade, Barnacled, and Nozu. While you wait for the next installment of this series, pay a visit to the current location of WRIR at 1621 West Broad Street, right above the Camel. After all, it won't be WRIR for much longer.